She walked into that building carrying 12 years of scars, 12 years of boardrooms that fell quiet when she entered, 12 years of her ideas being borrowed without credit, her promotions evaporating like morning fog, 12 years of being told, sometimes with words and sometimes with silence, that a woman who looked like her did not belong at the top of anything. She had survived every one of those rooms. And today, on a Tuesday morning in Seoul under fluorescent lights, with a cup of convenience store coffee going cold on a desk, one man was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. He was going to laugh at her resume. He was going to mock her name. And he was going to do it in front of a room full of people, without ever knowing that she was already his boss. The offices of Sinho Global Technologies occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower in Gangnam, Seoul, the kind of building that reflected clouds back at the sky and made visitors feel small before they even touched the revolving door. It was the kind of company that put its logo on things, on coffee mugs, on polo shirts, on the framed motivational quotes in the elevator that nobody read anymore. Cha Min-jun had worked there for 9 years. He was 37 years old, meticulously groomed, and deeply convinced of his own importance. He had the corner desk on the 14th floor, the one that faced the Han River, though he rarely looked up from his screen long enough to notice the view. He had 3 direct reports, 2 assistant managers, and a reputation that had been carefully cultivated over nearly a decade, the kind of reputation built not so much on brilliance as on the relentless, grinding consistency of someone who showed up early, stayed late, and never let anyone forget either of those facts. He was, by every metric the company used to measure such things, a solid performer. He was not, however, a kind man, not unkind in the dramatic villain of a movie sense. He did not raise his voice, he did not throw things, he did not send threatening emails at midnight. His cruelty was quieter than that. It lived in the slight curl of his lip when a subordinate mispronounced something. It lived in the way he forwarded emails with a single word, "see," just to establish that someone beneath him had gotten something wrong. It lived, most famously among his team, in the way he reviewed resumes. Every hiring cycle, Min-jun treated the resume pile like a performance. He would gather 2 or 3 of his closer colleagues, men like him, men who had grown up in the same system, men who laughed at the same things, and he would read the applications aloud. Not to assess them, to perform them, to find the ones that struck him as funny, to pull apart the names he found unusual, the career paths he found unconventional, the profiles that didn't look like what he thought talent was supposed to look like. He called it doing the culling. His colleagues called it Min-jun's morning show. Nobody called it what it actually was. On this particular Tuesday, the position open was a senior strategic operations role, a newly created post that sat on the org chart just beneath the executive level. It had been created quietly over the past 6 weeks as part of a restructuring that had been announced internally, but whose full implications had not yet been communicated to middle management. Min-jun only knew that the role existed and that HR had asked him to conduct a first-round screening. What he did not know, what no one in his orbit had thought to tell him because the information had traveled through channels he had no access to, was the reason the role had been created in such a hurry. Sinho Global Technologies had 3 weeks ago been acquired, and the woman who had led that acquisition, the woman who had personally negotiated the terms, who had flown into Seoul twice in the past month under a code name for confidentiality purposes, who had sat across a table from the board and impressed every single one of them with the kind of structured, visionary thinking that made senior men suddenly remember their manners. That woman had accepted the position of Chief Executive Officer. She would be starting officially in 48 hours. But she was in the building today because she had asked to be, because she believed in seeing a company from the inside before she walked in through the front door with a title. Because she had done this before, arrived quietly, watched, listened, and learned what kind of culture she was actually inheriting before the press release went out and everyone started performing for her. It was, she had told her assistant the night before, the only honest way to meet a place. Her name was Naomi Adeyemi. She was 41 years old, born in Lagos, educated in London, shaped by a decade in New York and another half-decade in Singapore. She held 2 master's degrees and a doctorate in organizational systems she had completed at night while running a regional division of a logistics conglomerate. She had been named to 3 consecutive global business leaders to watch lists, had turned around 2 failing companies, and had privately positioned herself as the person the Sinho board had decided they could not afford not to have. She was also, this morning, wearing a simple dark blazer, carrying a soft leather tote bag, and holding a resume that listed only her most recent experience, the consulting firm she'd fronted for the past 2 years, the one nobody at Sinho's middle management level would immediately recognize. She had submitted it through the normal application portal. She had done this, she would later explain, to see what happened, to see how the company treated people it had not yet decided to value. Min-jun arrived at the conference room at 8:47, 13 minutes before the scheduled screening session. He had a printout of 7 resumes, a large coffee, and the particular energy of a man who is looking forward to something he knows he should not be looking forward to. 2 of his colleagues were already there. Park Sung-woo from the product team, who had been invited because the new role touched his department, and Lee Hyun-ki, Min-jun's most reliable audience, who had no real reason to be there at all, except that he went wherever Min-jun went and laughed at whatever Min-jun laughed at. Min-jun set the resume stack on the table, took a long sip of coffee, and said with the casual authority of a man who runs his own show, "All right, let's see who thinks they belong here today." He went through the first 4 resumes with workman-like efficiency, pausing only to briefly note which ones were worth a second look. He was, in these moments, almost professional, almost the person his performance reviews said he was. Then he got to the 5th one. He picked it up, looked at the name at the top, read it once silently, then read it again aloud with a slight pause before each syllable, the way people do when they are not trying to pronounce something so much as perform their confusion about it. "Naomi Adeyemi," he said. He looked at Hyunki. Hyunki was already smiling. "Adeyemi," he said it again, slower this time, drawing the last syllable out. Where is that even from?" "African," Sung-woo said, not unkindly, just factually. "Is it?" Min-jun held the resume up slightly, as if examining it at arm's length might help him understand. "Because I looked at this and I thought, is this a person or is this the name of a street I've never heard of?" He chuckled at his own observation. Hyun-ki laughed. Sung-woo looked at the table. Min-jun continued. He read through the work history, and with each line his performance escalated slightly. The consulting firm she'd worked under recently he dismissed as vague and boutique. The international experience he characterized as scattered. It's like she couldn't decide where she wanted to be. The doctoral degree he called impressive on paper, but we've all met people with too many degrees and not enough actual sense. He turned to the section listing her areas of expertise: organizational restructuring, global integration, executive alignment, and said with the tired authority of someone who has been right about everything for 9 years, "You know what this is? This is someone who has studied what it looks like to run a company, but has never actually run one. Someone who comes in, makes a nice PowerPoint about culture, collects a fee, and is on a plane to the next place before the damage shows up. We don't need a consultant playing at executive. We need someone who bleeds for the work." He put the resume down. Then, as an afterthought, he picked it back up and made a small notation in the top corner, a circle with a line through it, the mark he used for applications he considered particularly misaligned, and slid it to the side of the stack with a finality that said this person's chance of being seen ends here, at this table, in this room, in front of these people. What none of the three men in that conference room knew was that approximately 40 feet away, in the small private office that had been quietly prepared for the incoming CEO's pre-start visits, Naomi Adeyemi was seated at a desk. She had arrived 40 minutes earlier. She had been told by the chief human resources officer, who was one of three people currently aware of the full situation, that her application had been routed to Min-jun's screening session. She had, with a stillness that the HR director found almost unnerving, said only, "Good, let it play out." She was not listening through the wall. She would hear about what happened in that conference room in approximately 3 hours. But she had known before she ever submitted that resume what the likely outcome would be. She had known because she had seen it before. She had known because she had built a methodology over the course of her career for walking into rooms she was not supposed to be in, watching what people did when they thought there were no consequences, and using that information to understand what kind of work needed to be done. The resume was not a trick. It was a test, and Min-jun had just failed it.
There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from overwork, but from the sustained effort of being perceived incorrectly. Naomi Adeyemi had lived inside that exhaustion for most of her professional life, and she had, over the years, made a deliberate choice about what to do with it. She had chosen not to let it make her bitter. Not because bitterness was wrong. She believed, actually, that bitterness was often rational, that it was often the only accurate emotional response to an irrational system, but because she had seen what bitterness did to the people she admired most, and she had decided she could not afford the cost of it. She had chosen, instead, to let it make her precise. Naomi had grown up in Lagos in a household where ambition was treated as a practical matter, not a romantic one. Her father was an engineer. Her mother ran a textile import business. Both of them worked with the particular focus of people who understood that the world did not hand things to anyone, and that the world handed considerably less to certain people than to others, and that this was neither fate nor justice, but simply the current state of a system that could, with sufficient effort, be changed. She had carried that understanding with her to London, where she had arrived at 22 with 2 suitcases and a scholarship to a university whose name opened doors in ways she had not fully anticipated. She had watched, in those early years, how differently she was treated in rooms depending on what she wore, how she spoke, who she was standing next to. She had filed these observations away. She had studied them the way other people studied market trends. By 30, she had developed what she privately called her taxonomy of dismissal, a careful catalog of the ways in which people in positions of institutional power communicated, consciously or not, that certain other people did not belong. The mispronounced name delivered with theatrical bewilderment, the resume held at arm's length, the credentials described as impressive on paper, that particular phrase, which she had heard so many times it had become almost funny, almost a punchline, except that it wasn't, because behind every instance of it was a real decision that affected a real person's life. She had learned to see it all, and she had learned, crucially, not to react to it in the moment, not because her reaction wouldn't have been justified, but because she had found, through experience, that the most devastating response to being underestimated was not anger. It was altitude. It was climbing so high, with such undeniable precision, that the people who had dismissed her eventually had to look up. And then, and this was the part that mattered most, the part she had built her leadership philosophy around, it was using that altitude not to exact revenge, but to change the room. To make sure the next woman with an unusual name, the next person with a non-linear resume, the next candidate who didn't look like what someone's unconscious bias had decided talent was supposed to look like, to make sure those people got a fair seat at the table. That was why she was here. That was why she had submitted the resume. That was why she had said when the HR director asked if she wanted security protocols for the day, "Just let me walk around. I want to see what this place actually is before I start trying to shape it into something better." At 11:15, Min-jun received an email. It came from the office of the board chairman, and its subject line read, Introductory Meeting 11:45 a.m., Conference Room A. The body of the email was brief. It said that the incoming CEO would be holding an informal introductory meeting with select department heads and senior managers as part of her pre-start orientation. It said that Cha Min-jun had been identified as one of the attendees. It said that the meeting was not optional. Min-jun read the email twice. He straightened his tie. He sent a message to Hyun-ki saying, "CEO's here already, apparently, heads up." He gathered his notebook and walked toward Conference Room A with the particular posture of a man who is performing confidence for an audience that does not exist. The conference room had been rearranged since the morning. The long table had been cleared. Chairs had been arranged in a loose semicircle. At the front of the room, near the window with the river view, stood the Chief Human Resources Officer, a woman named Kwon Ji-yeon, whom Min-jun respected precisely to the extent that her approval had ever mattered to his career. And standing beside Kwon, calm and still, and dressed in the same dark blazer she had been wearing when she walked into the building that morning, was Naomi Adeyemi. Min-jun did not recognize her immediately. There was no reason he would. He had never met her, had seen no photographs, had been told nothing beyond incoming CEO and a name that had not, until this moment, connected in his mind to any specific human being. And then, Jian said, "I'd like to introduce Dr. Naomi Adeyemi, who will be taking over as Chief Executive Officer of Sinho Global Technologies, effective this Thursday." The room processed this. Min-jun processed it a half-second behind everyone else. His eyes moved from Jian's face to Naomi's face, and in that movement, that brief, involuntary tracking, something shifted in his expression. It was not guilt, not yet. It was the particular blankness of a man whose brain is running several calculations simultaneously and has not yet arrived at an answer. Naomi looked at the room. She looked at the people in it. Her gaze moved with the steady, methodical quality of someone who had been reading rooms for 20 years, who had walked into hundreds of spaces where her presence was unexpected or unwelcome, or both, and who had long ago stopped letting the temperature of a room determine her own. She smiled. Not the smile of someone who was happy, exactly, the smile of someone who was ready. "Good morning. I know this is a little informal, and I appreciate you making time on short notice. I wanted to meet some of you before Thursday because I believe that titles matter much less than relationships, and I'd rather be a person to you before I'm a position." She spoke for 8 minutes. She spoke about the company, about what she had observed in her visits, about what she found impressive and what she thought could be better. She spoke about values. Not abstractly, not in the way that people speak about values when they mean to say nothing, but specifically, concretely, with examples drawn from what she had already seen inside this building. Min-jun sat very still through all of it. He had not said a word. And then, at the end of 8 minutes, she paused and she said something that was not in any script because she did not work from scripts and because she had decided in the 40 minutes she'd spent sitting alone in that small office earlier this morning that if she was going to build something real here, it needed to start with something real. She said, "I also want to say, and I want to say this while it's still my first day inside this building, that I believe the way a company treats the people it has not yet decided matter tells you everything about the company's character. Not how it treats the people it has already decided matter, how it treats everyone else." She let that sit for a moment. "I submitted a resume to an open position this morning. I submitted it through the normal portal with only my recent consulting experience listed. I wanted to see what would happen." The room had gone very quiet. "The resume was reviewed this morning, and I've been told what was said about the name, about the career path, about the credentials." She was not looking at Min-jun specifically, she was looking at the room, but everyone in the room looked at Min-jun. And Min-jun felt for the first time in a very long time the specific physical sensation of being genuinely, thoroughly seen. If this story is already living in your chest, subscribe right now and hit the bell because what happens behind that closed door next will be the part you never forget. And drop a comment below. Did he deserve a second chance or was it already too late? He did not say anything in the conference room. He could not.
The words he reached for, the explanations, the contextualizations, the habit of a career deflections that he had deployed successfully for 9 years whenever something needed to be walked back. None of them arrived in time. They were all still somewhere in transit when the meeting ended and people began to file out of the room, and he found himself standing near the window, alone, with the Han River in the background and the particular kind of silence that follows a public reckoning. Jian found him there. She did not approach him with fury. She approached him the way you approach a person who has been informed in front of witnesses that the life they have been quietly living is not the life they thought it was. She said simply, "She wants to speak with you at 2 o'clock." He nodded. He went back to his desk. He sat down. He looked at his computer screen for a long time without seeing anything on it. He thought about the morning, not the conference room, not Naomi Adeyemi's voice, but the earlier part, the part with the resumes and the coffee and Hyun-Ki's laughter and the ease of it all. The ease that he had never, not once, stopped to question, because it had always been easy, because the ease was the point, because the ease was the reward for 9 years of grinding and showing up early and staying late. He thought about his own resume, which he had submitted to this company 9 years ago, and which had been reviewed by someone who had known immediately, from the name at the top of it, what school he had likely attended, what family background he probably came from, what kind of man he was likely to be. He thought about how that recognition, that instant, unconscious legibility, had opened the first door. He thought about what it would have been like if that recognition had not been there. He was still sitting at his desk, hands flat on the surface, when 2 o'clock arrived. The meeting was in the small office near the end of the hallway, the one that had been prepared for Naomi. When Min-jun arrived, she was standing near the window again. She seemed to prefer windows. He would later decide, thinking back on this, that it was not a preference for light, but a preference for orientation, for having a fixed point in the external world while navigating the complexity of human rooms. She gestured to the chair across from her. She did not open with an accusation. She did not open with a performance of disappointment or with the particular administrative coldness that managers deploy when they want to remind someone that their continued employment is conditional. She opened with a question. She said, "Tell me about yourself, not your job. You." Min-jun blinked. It was not the opening he had prepared for. He talked, haltingly at first and then with more focus, for about 10 minutes. He talked about where he had grown up, a mid-sized city in the south of the country, a family that had not been wealthy, a father who had worked in manufacturing, and a mother who ran a small tutoring center. He talked about how he had been the first in his family to get a corporate job, how that had felt at 24, the specific pride and specific terror of it. He talked about the 9 years in this building, the ways the culture had shaped him, the things he had absorbed without noticing he was absorbing them. Naomi listened to all of it. Then she said, "I want you to understand something. I'm not here to end your career. I'm not here to punish you publicly, because I don't believe public punishment changes anything except the behavior people perform in front of witnesses. What I'm here to do, what I intend to do in this role, is change the conditions that make what happened this morning not only possible, but normal." She paused. "What you did this morning," she said, "was not unusual. That's the problem. It was so normal, so unremarkable, so routine that no one in that room thought twice about it, not even the people who were uncomfortable. And a culture that has normalized that kind of dismissal is a culture that has been quietly bleeding talent for years. People like me, people whose names get performed instead of pronounced, people whose credentials get described as impressive but not quite right, people who are told in 1,000 different ways that they will only ever be considered almost, those people leave, or they never arrive, and the company never even notices the gap because it never knew what it was missing." Min-jun was quiet for a long time after she stopped speaking. Then he said, in a voice that was smaller than the one he had been using all morning, "I don't know how to say that I'm sorry in a way that isn't small." Naomi looked at him steadily. "Then don't start with sorry," she said. "Start with different." Thursday came.
The official announcement went out. The press release, the internal memo, the all-hands meeting that Naomi opened by walking to the center of the room without a podium or a prepared set of talking points and speaking for 40 minutes about the kind of company she intended to build, the kind of culture she believed was possible, the things she had already seen in the 3 days she had spent walking the halls before anyone with a badge knew who she was. She spoke about the resume, not by naming names. She would never name names in a public forum because she did not believe in spectacle, but by telling the story, in the third person, of a woman who had submitted an application to her own company and been dismissed before anyone had read past her name. She used it not as a story of failure, but as a diagnosis. A company is not its value statement. A company is not its mission on the wall or its diversity metrics in the annual report. A company is what it does when nobody is watching. It is what it does with the person who hasn't proven their value yet. It is what it does with the name it doesn't recognize. It is what it does when the stakes feel low and the behavior feels inconsequential and no one is going to write about it in a press release. She paused and let the room sit with that. We are going to be different. Not because I'm asking you to be better people, I believe you already are, but because I'm going to change the systems and the habits and the unchallenged routines that make it easier to dismiss than to engage, easier to mock than to consider, easier to protect what's familiar than to make room for what's excellent. The room was full. Cha Min-jun was in it, near the back, in a chair that was not his corner desk on the 14th floor, but a folding chair in a conference room, which was right and appropriate because some reckonings require you to sit in the back and listen. He listened. He had been doing a lot of listening in the past 48 hours. He had called his mother, which he had not done in several months, and he had not talked about work. He had listened to her talk about the tutoring center, about a student she was proud of, about the small dignities and small frustrations of her days. He ate dinner alone and thought about the 9 years, and about all the people whose resumes he had performed, whose names he had mispronounced for an audience, whose careers might have looked different if the first door they encountered had not been his. He did not arrive at absolution. He did not expect to. But he arrived, sitting in that folding chair, listening to his new CEO speak with the authority of someone who had earned every syllable of it, at something that felt like the beginning of a reckoning with himself, the kind that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but simply starts, quietly, with the decision to be something other than what you've been. 3 weeks after Naomi's first official day, the company launched what she called the Threshold Initiative, a comprehensive audit of its hiring practices, its internal promotion patterns, its compensation data, and what she described as its invisible architecture, the unwritten rules and unconscious habits that shaped who got seen and who got passed over. The initiative was run by an external team, but it was overseen by a new internal committee that Naomi had personally assembled. Among its members was Kwon Jian. Among its members was a junior analyst from the product team who had approached Naomi after the all-hands meeting to say, quietly, that she had been watching certain patterns in the company for 2 years and had not known who to tell. Among its members, in a role that Naomi had offered him deliberately and not without considerable thought, was Cha Min-jun. She had offered it to him in a follow-up meeting, their third conversation in as many weeks, and she had explained her reasoning with the directness that had become already one of the things people found both difficult and necessary about her. You know this culture from the inside, she had said. You know every shortcut and every excuse and every way that people talk themselves into the behavior I'm trying to change, because you've used all of them. That knowledge is valuable, not because I want you to protect it, but because I want you to help me dismantle it, if you're willing to do the work honestly. She did not tell him it would be comfortable. She did not tell him it would rehabilitate his reputation or restore the ease he had carried around like a birthright. She told him only that it mattered, and that mattering, real mattering, the kind that changes something in the world rather than just in the story you tell about yourself, required the willingness to sit in the discomfort of what you have been in order to build something better. He said yes. It was perhaps the most important word he had ever spoken.
In the evenings, after the meetings and the one-on-ones and the strategic sessions and the building-level conversations that were already in their third and fourth week, beginning to shift the temperature of the place, Naomi would sometimes stand at the window of her office, her actual office now, the one on the 16th floor with the corner view, and let herself be tired. She did not perform her tiredness for anyone. She did not talk about it in interviews or mention it in the speeches she was already being invited to give. She simply stood at the window and let the weight of the day and of the years before the day settle through her. And then she set it down, the way you set down a bag that you have been carrying for a very long time and have, at last, found a place to put. She thought about all the rooms she had walked into before this one. She thought about the ones where her name had been a performance, the ones where her credentials had been held at arm's length, the ones where she had watched herself being dismissed by people who would never know, who would never be required to reckon with the precise cost of their casual cruelty. She did not think about those rooms with bitterness. She thought about them with the focused, architectural attention of someone who has spent their entire career learning to look at a broken structure and understand, from that brokenness, exactly what needs to be built differently. She had been asked, in an interview several years ago, what drove her, what kept her going through the years of being overlooked and underestimated and required to carry twice the weight for half the recognition. She had said, without hesitation, the next woman. The next woman who walks into a room like the ones I've walked into, she had said. The one who's brilliant and prepared and bringing something genuinely excellent to the table. I want that woman to have a different experience than I had. I want the doors to be open for her in ways they weren't open for me. That's not charity. That's architecture. I'm building something. I'm just building it for people I'll never meet. She was building it here, now, in this building, in this city, in this company that had once, on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning, let a man with a red pen and an audience mock a name he did not recognize and a resume he did not understand. The man was still here. He was changed, or beginning to be. The name was still the same. And the name, Naomi Adeyemi, spoken correctly, spoken in full, spoken with the weight and specificity it deserved, was now on the door. There is a version of this story that ends with the firing. That version is simpler, and in its simplicity, more satisfying in the immediate, visceral way that satisfying things sometimes are. The villain punished, the victim vindicated, the system corrected by subtraction, remove the bad actor, restore the balance, close the chapter. Naomi Adeyemi did not write that version because she did not believe that subtraction was architecture, because she had spent enough of her career watching institutions respond to crises of culture by making examples of individuals, performing accountability without building accountability, and she had seen, repeatedly, that this changed nothing, that the behavior returned, wearing different clothes, sitting at different desks, speaking in the voices of people who had watched the example-making and learned only to be more careful about who was in the room. She wrote a different version, a harder version, a longer version, a version with no cathartic moment of reversal, no scene where the person who underestimated her is publicly, permanently humiliated, and she walks away in slow motion while the credits roll. A version that required more from everyone, including the man who made the mistake, including the organization that had allowed the mistake to become routine, including herself, because leadership that asks hard things of others must first be honest about its own complexity and its own cost. This is that version. It is ongoing. It does not yet have an ending, but its beginning, that Tuesday morning, that resume, that name read aloud for an audience that was laughing, that beginning is precise and documented and true. And somewhere in the trajectory between that beginning and whatever comes after it, something is changing. In a glass tower above the Han River, in a company that is learning to see differently, that something is being built, one name at a time.